Welcome. So there really should be two people on stage here. Barb has been, she's not only my life partner, she's my research collaborator on this. Without her, there wouldn't have been any IARPA forecasting tournaments with the intelligence community. It's hard to say where her work ends and my work begins often in the IARPA project. My rule of thumb is that Barb does the deep scientific work and I do the public relations. So that's the division of labor. Should also thank John and his crew for all their help, Katinka, Max, Nina, and Russell. And then I wanted to say a few words about Danny Kahneman and his role in all this. I'm not sure he remembers all the different things he's done over the last 25, 30 years to facilitate all of this. But in the beginning, I was doing very small-scale forecasting tournaments. I was at Berkeley, and I remember in the late 1980s, I don't know if Danny remembers, but he went to Chicago, to the MacArthur Foundation, to argue for MacArthur should be supporting forecasting tournaments, and they did eventually come up with something, not as nearly as much as I wanted, but they came up with something. So that was very helpful. But just conversations with Danny through the years have been very helpful in thinking about this. We had a lunch at a Chinese restaurant, I think it was called Yen Qing in Berkeley in the late 1980s. And he offhandedly tossed off this remark that he thought that the average political expert would be hard-pressed to beat in a forecasting tournament an attentive reader of the New York Times. And that's been a benchmark that some of my political science colleagues have been struggling to beat ever since. And he also has been very helpful, I think, in trying to persuade the intelligence community to take seriously the lessons of the forecasting tournament. So he did Amtrak down to DC with me last year to talk to the National Intelligence Council and the Director of National Intelligence about the value of explicitly keeping score, explicit probability scoring, learning from feedback. These might seem like truisms to scientists, but they're really still quite radical, even revolutionary ideas in much of the intelligence community. So I'm not implying that he agrees with everything I'm going to say. I think we certainly have some differences of opinion, and I'm probably more of an optimist than he is on the degree to which people will ultimately embrace these technologies. But he has been very helpful, so thank you. And I'm going to start this conversation off with a couple of stories and that I think provide a nice point of entry into the 130 slides that you have in front of you in this notebook. And I'll also offer the reassurance that I have no intention of frog marching you through all 130 slides. As issues come up, we might refer to particular things in here, but we're not going to go through these slides one by one. It would be really useful if we went around the table, because I'm having a very hard time seeing people beyond about the middle.
Just your name, what you do, in 30 seconds or less.
Bob Axel, I'm a political scientist from Michigan. I do game theory and national security.
Danny Halutz, I'm an engineer.
Danny Kahneman, I'm a psychologist.
Anne Treisman, I'm another psychologist.
Saw kindergarten on leave last year, but my last role was leading YouTube for Google, which I did for about 5 years.
Well, the name, I used to work for Google as well. I'm a political activist and now working for a startup called Target.
Ludwig Ziele, I'm a journalist. I cover technology for The Economist.
I'm Glenn Cray. I am a journalist and I run the Feuilleton, the Arts and Essays section for the Süddeutsche Zeitung in Germany.
I'm Brian Christian. I'm a writer, and I write about mostly the intersection of computer science and philosophy.
Katinka Matson, co-founder of Edge.
Max Brockman, here at Edge.
Ian Kamen, I'm an Edge groupie. When I'm not doing that, I make stuff.
I'm D.A. Wallach. I'm a musician and investor.
I'm Rodney Brooks. I'm a reformed academic and I make robots.
I'm
Rory Sutherland, I work for Pogsley and Mather in London, the advertising agency, and also write on technology for The Spectator.
I'm Peter Lee. I work at a place called Microsoft Research, and I guess I'm a corrupted academic.
Corrupt button.
Jennifer Jacquet, pure boring academic, environmental social sciences.
John Brothman, editor of Edge.
Stuart Brand, the Long Now Foundation, and Revive and Restore for the extension.
Margaret Levy, Director, Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford, CASPIS, as it's affectionately known, and a political scientist.
Barb Mellers, psychologist at UPenn.
So I said I would start off with a couple of stories, and that's exactly what I'll do. So the first story is about President Obama and the search for Osama bin Laden. And in 2010, early 2011, evidence was gradually accumulating about the location of Osama bin Laden. The intelligence community was growing more confident. They knew where he was, and as the confidence grew, they started reporting higher up in the hierarchy. They reported to Leon Panetta, then director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and eventually directly to President Obama. And they made presentations to both of these men, and in these presentations, they made probability judgments about the likelihood that Osama was indeed residing in that mysterious walled-up compound in the Pakistani town of Abbottabad. And in the case, there's a version of this in the movie Zero Dark 30, which we've checked out with Dan did a great job checking out with the people who were actually there, so don't believe the movie. But the movie's not too far off in this particular. They went around the table asking the advisors, the intelligence officers, what they thought the likelihood was of Osama being there. And the probabilities ranged from about 35% to 95%, with a median of about 0.75, so 75%. And President Obama looked a little bit frustrated, and he said, well, you know, it seems like it's a coin flip, 50-50. And that was that, for the purposes of that meeting. Now, I want to bracket this question. Did President Obama utilize the probabilities in the right way? Did he draw the right conclusion or inference from the information displayed in that meeting? So bracket that question and now move to a thought experiment in which President Obama has the advisors around him. And the advisors, instead of offering a dispersion of probability estimates, the advisors all say the same thing. They all say 75%. Now, let's also say that the advisors, let's stipulate for our thought experiment, that the advisors have overcome the siloization problem that the U.S. intelligence community was severely criticized for after 9/11, the notion that they weren't sharing information enough. So overcoming siloization means that each advisor knows what every other advisor knows. They all know the same thing. They've all conferred, and what probability should President Obama take from that? And in effect, I'm stipulating that the advisors are intellectual clones of each other. They're cognitive clones of each other. So the probability is presumptively 75%. It's as if one person were speaking to them. But then imagine a version in which all the advisors say the same thing. Each says 75%. But they haven't overcome the siloization problem. One official has access to satellite reconnaissance, another has code breaking, another has spies on the ground, another has cell phone stuff. They have different information, and they're siloized, and they say 75%. What's the correct probabilistic inference in this situation? And the answer is mathematically indeterminate. I haven't given you enough information to answer it. But it is something that can be statistically estimated. And Barb and the top statistician for our project, Lyle Ungar, and other people have developed algorithms for estimating the extent to which you should adjust your probability when you have diverse inputs into an estimate. Does everyone have an intuition about the answer here?
Depends on the correlation among the information.
It depends on the correlation among the information, but we're assuming some diversity and a moderately low correlation.
It's got to be higher than 75.
It's got to be higher than 75, but how much higher is indeterminate because we don't have enough information. But it is something that if you're running a forecasting tournament over an extended period of time and you had, say, 500 plus questions and thousands of forecasters and you have estimates of diversity and you have estimates of accuracy over long periods of time, you can work out algorithms that do a better job of distilling the wisdom of the crowd than, say, simple averaging. It sounds risky, but it's an algorithm known as extremizing, and it works out pretty well. Let's do it. So those are all thought experiments, right? With everybody saying the same thing, 75%. So if you go back to the real world in which President Obama got the dispersion of estimates, imagine another situation. President Obama is sitting down with friends and they're relaxing and they're watching March Madness basketball game. He's a fan of March Madness. And there's going to be a game between Duke University and Ohio State, and the people around him make estimates of the probability of Duke winning. And the estimates are exactly like the estimates we got on Osama. They start around 35%, they go up to 95%, the center of gravity around 75%. Do you think President Obama would have said, when his buddies offered these odds estimates, sounds like 50-50 to me? Or would he have said something like, sounds like 3-1 favoring Duke? 3-1 favoring Duke. So it's an interesting fact that in very high stakes national security debates and many other types of high stakes policy debates as well, people don't think it's possible to make very granular probability estimates. Sometimes they seem to act as though things are going to happen, there's maybe, and things aren't going to happen. Sometimes they act as though there'll be only 3 levels of uncertainty. Sometimes they might act as if there is 5 or 7. One of the things we found in the IARPA forecasting tournaments is that super forecasters collectively can distinguish many more degrees of uncertainty even than 7. And it's an interesting question, how useful is that? Let's bracket that also for later. But it is possible to make more subtle and granular distinctions among degrees of uncertainty on questions that are of interest to the U.S. intelligence community. That's, I think, an empirical demonstration from the IARPA tournaments. I think it's pretty solid. And the juxtaposition of President Obama on the Osama problem and on the March Madness problem illustrates that it's not that he can't think in a granular way about probability. He may be implicitly thinking it's impossible to think in a granular way about national security, or it's not even normatively appropriate to become all that granular in the national security domain. There are different norms, different epistemic norms seem to govern what it is or is not appropriate to say about uncertainty. Now, in the handout that accompanies the slides, I've got a page in which I pose the question, what are the limits on probabilistic reasoning? Do you know? Does anyone know? So it's fair to say, I think, that the vast majority of college-educated people believe that probability theory is useful in estimating the likelihood of a fair coin landing heads 5 times in a row. They think probability theory is useful if you're playing poker and you're drawing cards from a well-defined sampling universe. These are classic domains for frequentist statistics. The question we're confronting here is, what are the limits on the usefulness of probability? To what extent is it useful to elicit probability judgments for quote-unquote seemingly unique historical events? Now, on this page, I list a number of situations in which people find it vexing to make probability judgments. The first one is there intelligent life elsewhere in the Milky Way? I don't know, there's Drake's formula and there are various ways of trying to guesstimate things like this, but I don't think I personally can do much better than say, I certainly don't think it's impossible. And I don't think it's 100% certain either. So it's somewhere between 0.0001 and 0.9999, but can I do appreciably better than that? Is granularity possible? Well, as Kepler keeps discovering more planets, and we find more planets in habitable zones, and eventually we can pick up atmospheric signatures of oxygen and so forth in the atmospheres, eventually we might might start changing our estimates, but we're still at such an early stage, I don't think I can do much better than that. Then there's a lot of other questions that are listed here, and we don't need to go through each of them now. But the question I want you to keep in the back of your mind is, can the probabilities of these types of questions, can the answers be meaningfully guesstimated? And on which ones do you think it is possible to offer meaningful guesstimates? On which ones don't you think it's possible, and why? Because that's essentially a question about the limits of the usefulness of something like an IARPA forecasting tournament. IARPA is, in a sense, stretching the limits of the usefulness of probability. Okay, that's one story I wanted to use to capture one of the big issues we'll be grappling with. The second story is the story with which Dan and I begin the Superforecasting book, and it's the parable of Tom Friedman and Bill Flack. It's a tale of two forecasters. Everybody around this table knows who Tom Friedman is. He's this world-famous New York Times columnist, award-winning columnist, anyway, so Tom is a regular at Davos on CNN. He was in the White House. He's been in the White House many times, in the Oval Office many times. Recently, Barack Obama gave him a privileged interview access on the Iranian nuclear deal. This is not an unusual event in the life of Tom Friedman. So that's Tom Friedman. And then there's this guy, Bill Flack. And Bill Flack is, he's a retired irrigation specialist. He'd worked for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Nebraska. He has no track record of writing on world politics. He's never been invited to sit on a panel with Tom Friedman or for that matter, anybody else. And the question is, who is likely to be a better forecaster? And you can bracket that question also. You don't have to answer it out loud. Now, this is something where Danny Kahneman's attribution substitution heuristic starts to come into play in a big way. There's obviously no doubt in our minds about who is higher in the academic or policy, social pecking order. I mean, Tom Friedman is one of the most famous, well-connected journalists in the world, and Bill Flack, let's face it, is a nobody in Nebraska. And so there's also no doubt about who is the more acclaimed and prolific writer on topics that are relevant to the IARPA tournament. And Tom is good at turning a phrase, and there are he's written some wonderful columns, in my opinion. One of his particularly insightful columns was one he wrote in late 2002, before the 2003 invasion of Iraq. And he posed a question. He said, is Iraq the way it is because Saddam is the way he is? Or is Saddam the way he is because Iraq is the way it is? I think that's a brilliant question. I think it would have been helpful if the US administration had given much deeper thought to that question. Tom Friedman didn't know the answer to that question, by the way, but he was able to formulate it in a very interesting way. More recently, as when oil prices plunged in 2014, Tom Friedman wrote a very interesting piece on the correlation between price of oil and instability, political instability in petrostates like Venezuela or Iran. He also talked about the role of the oil price collapse in the 1980s and the collapse of the Soviet Union. So he's written a lot of interesting things, and he's written his book, The Lexus and the Olive Tree. It synthesizes globalization arguments with arguments about our cultural, religious groundedness in specific places and the tension between those forces. He's written a lot of interesting stuff. He's a good storyteller. He can go from micro to macro and macro to micro really fast, seemingly seamlessly. He's very good at this. And by contrast, Bill Flack has no track record of writing interesting things like this. So if you were to use Danny's attribution substitution heuristic, if you were to think in system 1 rather than system 2 mode about the problem, you might be inclined to slip into thinking, well, is Tom Friedman a better forecaster? Well, I don't really know, but I do know that he's got a lot higher status. He has a lot more clout at the Council of Foreign Relations. He sold a lot more books. There are a lot of reasons for believing. What the attribution substitution heuristic is, you take a really hard question, like is Tom a better forecaster, and you seamlessly substitute an easier question you can answer, and then you act as though the answer to the easier question is also an answer to the harder question. And a lot of this can occur very quickly, automatically, this kind of substitution. People do find it somewhat vexing to be asked questions that are unresolvable, and there is this kind of irritable reaching for certainty, as one poet famously once put it. Of course, the right answer to the question, is Tom Friedman a better forecaster, is nobody knows. But it's easy to get snookered by the attribution substitution heuristic. Now, there are some interesting counterarguments. And one of them is, well, okay, I still think the rational answer is Tom Friedman. I don't know what Tom Friedman's forecasting record is, but I do know that he has high status, and I do know that he has writing skill. And I'm going to make a bet, an epistemic bet, as it were, that these skills, the status and the writing skills, are at least positively correlated with forecasting skill. Right? You could argue that. Now it turns out, though, and we know this from the ARPA tournament, and Barb and I worked on for a number of years now. We also knew this from my earlier forecasting work as well, that the correlation between your ability to tell a good explanatory story and your forecasting accuracy is rather weak. So it's not as strong an argument as you might think. Even if it is positive, it's not all that strong. And there's a very powerful countervailing reason for believing that Bill Flack is a better forecaster. And that is because Bill Flack is a scientifically documented, officially certified IARPA tournament superforecaster. He did a great job assigning probability estimates to hundreds of questions posed over 4 years in the IARPA forecasting tournament. A superb performance. This is with neutral umpires, no room for fudging. This is objective scoring. So it's quite possible that Tom Friedman is a better forecaster, excuse me, but Bill Flack is a better forecaster. And that, I guess, it brings us to what I see as a core paradox in the Superforecasting book, and that is, why is it that we know so much about Bill Flack's forecasting record and so little about Tom Friedman's? And why is it that most of the time we don't even know that we don't know that, and we don't even seem to care? Is that a satisfactory intellectual state of affairs? Is that a good way to be conducting high-stakes policy debates, by relying on proxies like social status, the ability to tell a good story, in determining who has the most impact on the policy debates? Well, I'll just say one more thing about this. Tom Friedman often, if you read Tom Friedman's columns carefully, you'll see that he does make a lot of implicit predictions. He warned us, for example, early in the Clinton administration, right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that expanding NATO eastward could trigger a nasty Russian nationalist backlash. He's warned us about a number of things, and he uses the language of could or may, that various things could or might happen. When you ask people what do could or might mean in isolation, they mean anything from about 0.1 probability to about 0.85 probability. They have a vast range of possible meanings. This means that it's virtually impossible to assess the empirical track record of Tom Friedman, and Tom Friedman is by no means alone. It's not at all unusual for pundits to make extremely forceful claims about violent nationalist backlashes or impending regime collapses in this or that place, but to riddle it with vague verbiage quantifiers of uncertainty that could mean anything from 0.1 to 0.9. It is as though pundits, high-status pundits, have learned a valuable survival skill. And that survival skill is, they've mastered the art of appearing to go out on a limb without actually going out on a limb. They say dramatic things, but they're vague verbiage quantifiers connected to the dramatic things. So it sounds as though they're saying something very compelling and riveting. There's a scenario that's been conjured up in your mind of something either very good or very bad. It's vivid, it's easily imaginable. But it turns out on close inspection, they're not really saying that's going to happen. They're not specifying the conditions or a time frame or a likelihood. So there's no way of actually assessing accuracy. Now you could say these pundits are just doing what a rational pundit would do because they know that they live in a somewhat stochastic world. They know that it's a world that frequently is going to throw up surprises at them. So to maintain their credibility with their community of co-believers, to maintain that credibility, they need to be vague. It's an essential survival skill. And I think there's some considerable truth to that. I think that's and forecasting tournaments are a very different way of proceeding. Forecasting tournaments require people to attach explicit probabilities to well-defined outcomes and well-defined timeframes so you can keep score. So these are very different ways of doing business. There's the traditional status hierarchy, and then there is the forecasting tournament. And the phrase we use in the book is we say that forecasting tournaments are a disruptive technology because they have the potential to destabilize stale status hierarchies that are dominated by people who are really good at telling explanatory stories after the fact, but aren't very good at predicting.
Phil, you invited some of these pundits to participate in the tournaments. What was their response?
We have indeed. Dan Gardner insisted that we do that, and the response was very unenthusiastic. There was a small number of people who were willing to participate if they could be totally anonymous, but a 90% plus turned it down.
In interesting ways or kind of just stupid, obvious ways? I mean, how much did they engage the problem?
Well, Dan was fielding that correspondence, so I don't know. I didn't go through it in detail, but my sense is that a large fraction of them didn't even bother to respond, and that another fraction offered somewhat polite but dismissive responses. I'm sorry, I don't have the time. But also, interestingly, some of them offered a defense that I think is really wrong-headed, and that is I say I don't really make predictions. It's not what I do. I'm not in the prediction business.
Did any of them, besides David Brooks, ever refer to your work then in their own columns?
Yes, and I don't want to talk about the specific people we invited or didn't invite, but no, a number of journalists have. Actually, I know of no. So this work's been written up by a number of pretty high-profile journalists, and I have yet to see a negative review of the work. So they have not been hostile toward the work, although I think that may change.
In fairness, nevertheless, it would be a large commitment of time.
I'm sorry.
It would be a large commitment of time to be in this. To answer these 400 or 500 questions.
Right, but you don't have to answer them all. You could get reasonable accuracy feedback if you were, over the course of a year or so, to answer 50.
So all of the participants were totally volunteers. They weren't paid.
The description of how the forecasting tournament itself worked begins 15. Starting clearing the scientific or clearing the conceptual underbrush, the things you need to work out in order to do a forecasting tournament. It's not as though the U.S. intelligence community exists in a world in which they're not held accountable for the judgments they make. It's the type of accountability. It's capricious. It's designed to induce shame if they get something big wrong. Where getting something big wrong can be defined very expansively. So did the intelligence community miss 9/11? Well, they did create a memorandum that went to Condi Rice a few months before then saying bin Laden planning to attack the United States. That didn't say they were going to smash airliners into buildings in the Pentagon and New York City, but it did offer a warning of sorts. But the intelligence community, for better or for worse, was held responsible for missing 9/11. That would be a false negative judgment. They were subsequently held responsible for overestimating weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, overestimating the likelihood of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. That's a false positive error. One of the things about learning in Washington, D.C. and the intelligence community is if you're going to make a mistake, make sure you don't make the last mistake. So if you make the mistake of missing something, missing a threat, make sure you don't miss another one. And if you make the mistake of having a false positive on a threat, make sure you don't make another false positive right away. Show at least that you're responsive to the political blame game calculus. So we use the term accountability ping pong, that the intelligence community in some sense is whacked back and forth from making one error to the other. That is a form of learning, I suppose, in a very simple sense. But it's not the kind of learning that we're aspiring to achieve in the ARPA forecasting tournament. We're trying to learn to achieve a higher hit rate at, we're trying to improve our hit rate without simultaneously degrading our resistance to false positives.
It's also presumably true that actually making correct predictions is only part of what the intelligence community is there for.
Yes.
It's also there for coming up with stories that support whatever the decision is.
Yes, storytelling is indeed arguably the basis on which analysts are ultimately promoted or career stagnant. Yeah.
Well, that's a kind of storytelling.
Yeah, the intelligence community would be offended a little bit by what you said, Danny, because they see themselves as a objective. They see themselves in principle as speaking truth to power. They're not there in a justification role, and
Except for the very top.
Except for the very top, right? Who are political appointees.
I feel a bit bad for Tom Friedman here.
Yeah, I'm sorry, just a little louder.
I'm feeling a little bad for Tom Friedman here.
Good.
And let me pose a. When you can isolate things down to the sorts of questions on the last page here, which are all very well formed questions. That's one thing, but there's an also argument that the sorts of things Tom Friedman is doing is finding out what the questions are.
Yes.
And that he is living in a world where the opponents are doing the same sort of thing. Is North Korea asking these crisp questions, or are they telling stories themselves too, for instance? So it's a much more complex dynamic. And I'll just step back. In my own world right now, I am besieged by people asking me a question which I refuse to answer, and they get very angry at me for refusing to answer, because other people keep answering. The question is, in what year will we have human-level equivalence intelligence from computers? And I say, it's an ill-formed question. And they say, but everyone else answers it, and I think they answer it for... They shouldn't answer it because it's ill-formed.
Right. Now, the ARPA questions, of course, are not ill-formed in that sense, because they pass the clairvoyance test. The clairvoyance test means that if the question is so well framed that if you handed it to a genuine clairvoyant who could see perfectly into the future, the clairvoyant could look into the future, say thumbs up or thumbs down, without needing to come back to you for some ex post facto re-specification of what the question was. So the problem you're having there is a question that fails the clairvoyance test. But I couldn't agree more with the sentiment you're expressing about Tom Friedman as a creative question generator. We move away from the Tom versus Bill tension to Tom and Bill. And But it is a Tom and Bill symbiosis. A healthy intellectual tournament ecosystem requires people who are creative question generators as much as it does people who are skillful at generating accurate probability estimates. And some of the examples I gave you earlier about petrostate instability, or is Iraq the way it is because Saddam is the way he is, or vice versa, those are really smart questions. Now, they're not questions that are quite ready for forecasting tournament application because they don't pass the clairvoyance test yet. But they're moving in that direction. And I think one of the most valuable collaborations that could be facilitated, and if this were a partial outcome of this gathering, I would consider it enormously successful, would be creating a framework for encouraging the Tom Friedmans of the world to play as question generators in forecasting tournaments, and agreeing that if questions resolve in a certain way within a certain time period, they would at least make some marginal adjustments to their beliefs. So Tom Friedman is a cautious supporter of the Iranian nuclear agreement right now. You could imagine posing a series of questions about very resolvable questions in the next 12 to 24 months about how the Iranian nuclear agreement unfolds that would cause either skeptics of the agreement or proponents of the agreement to change their mind somewhat. Now, what does change their mind mean? Well, it doesn't mean going from yes to no. It might mean going from, I think there's a 0.85 chance that the Iranians are not going to develop a nuclear weapon in secret, or they're not going to cheat in this way or that way on the agreement. I think there's a point, moving that from 0.85 to 0.6 or to 0.75. Belief change is often, among the best forecasters in the ARPA tournament, belief change tends to be quite granular. They think that Hillary Clinton has a 60% chance of being the next president of the United States today, and then some information comes out from the State Department Inspector General about Hillary's emails and her possible culpability for her email policy. Okay, I think I'm going to move it down to 0.58 now. That's the sort of thing super forecasters do. And the cumulative result is that their probability scores, as defined in these handouts here and in the book, their probability scores are much better. The gaps between their probability judgments and reality are smaller, where you dummy code reality as 0 or 1, depending on whether the event didn't occur or did occur.
Sort of along the same lines, trying to, I doubt that Tom Friedman is thinking this way, but one reason to waffle a little bit is you're telling a story about some topic of wide interest, but to make a forecast for that, there's some Bayesian process or some set of conditional probabilities where some of those nodes might be 50-50, and then it becomes, depending on how those earlier events turn out, you might have very definitive forecasts for the final event of interest.
Right. I certainly agree that we're talking about complex causal networks that could in principle be represented as Bayesian inference diagrams. I think that's right. I think some of the question clusters we've been developing in the ARPA tournament are moving in that direction. In the ARPA tournament to date, what we have done is we've asked conditional questions. So if US policy goes toward A or B, how likely is a given consequence? Now, this allows us to assess the accuracy in the world in which one of the other policies is implemented. So let's say policy A is chosen, we know what happens. Now, interestingly, we don't know what would have happened if we'd done policy B. That's in the realm of counterfactual. And this is one of the great limitations in our ability to learn to become better calibrated in historical environment, because history doesn't offer control groups. Everything is counterfactual. And in policy debates, we have this really pretty perverse situation in which people routinely make up the data. They routinely invent convenient counterfactual control groups that make the policies they prefer look good. So it's even possible to take a policy like, say, the invasion of Iraq, which almost everybody has bailed on, but you could construct a counterfactual that says, well, you know what? You think things are bad now. You have no idea how bad they would have been if Saddam had stayed in power. So there were people who argued for, defended the Vietnam War or the Iraq War on those grounds, even after most opinion had bailed out. But counterfactuals are a very interesting and integral part, and that the third session of this series will deal with counterfactual inference in policy debates.
Just to say, I would be very interested in knowing if the Seahawks will win the next Super Bowl.
Fair enough. Well, there are benchmarks out there, right? I mean, there must be Las Vegas bookies and so forth. There may be prediction markets. There are benchmarks that we could use to engage our initial probability estimation process. Yeah.